So domain number 9, so threat and vulnerability management, or TVM. So again, this is Greg on Greg's soapbox, but threat intel is great. Threat intel gives you the ability to learn from others' experience, right? So if you subscribe to ACSC or OSCERT or a private company like Recorded Future or what have you to get their threat intel, that makes a lot of sense. I would argue the best threat intel is threat intel that you have generated for yourself. The other threat intel, yes, is interesting, yes, is important, and yes, is good, but it is not as applicable to your environment or targeted to your environment as threat intel that your cybersecurity team is generating based on what they are seeing as far as attacks or attempted attacks within your environment. So always look to generate your own threat intel and add that to your environment, to your system, so that you're learning from your own behaviors that people are using to attack you, basically. And then reduce cybersecurity vulnerabilities. Cybersecurity vulnerabilities is it's not threat intel at all. It's vulnerabilities pieces, and everyone I think is well aware of what vulnerabilities are. But same idea is that how are you collecting, how are you learning about your vulnerabilities, right? What sources are you using to validate whether or not you have a vulnerability or not? There are many vendors out there that, especially on the IT side, that will scan the network. You can do a credentialed scan that will look at all the open ports that are on all the endpoint devices and what programs are holding open those ports and find what vulnerabilities are on those particular applications. That's pretty dangerous. It's not something I would recommend at all in the OT space. So if you can find a vendor that does scanless asset vulnerability management or detection, that would be a key win, I would think, so that you're not accidentally knocking devices offline during a scan, for example. Look at this information. Do this regularly because new vulnerabilities are just coming out daily. I hate to say it, but daily there are new vulnerabilities. Most of them hopefully are not in your environment, but you don't know if you are not checking. And then how do you mitigate vulnerabilities? So it could be as simple and straightforward and yet as complicated as applying a patch. You may know that that patch will solve that vulnerability problem, but do you know if that patch has been approved by the OEM or not? That's a separate question altogether. Maybe you don't want to do a patch. Maybe the patch requires a reboot. So maybe there's some other mechanism that you can put in place to mitigate that, or even a compensating control of some kind. Any thoughts, George, on that?
It's well said, Greg. I mean, vulnerability monitoring management in the OT space is imperative. We mentioned that sometimes you may need a mitigating control because you won't be able to patch, or maybe you have all of the mitigations from an attack path perspective that allows you not to patch a vulnerability. So
right.
Just because something has a high CVSS score doesn't mean you have to patch it immediately. So it's one of the items that we're looking at and working on here consistently about providing our customers with exactly the data that they require in order to make an assessment from a vulnerability and patching perspective.
Well said. Yeah, so a vulnerability is a vulnerability, but it doesn't really mean a thing if it can't be taken advantage of.
Exactly.
Right? So you may be perfectly fine documenting the fact that you have a vulnerability or 10 vulnerabilities because the way to take advantage of those vulnerabilities are not available in the OT network that you have.
Exactly.
That's totally acceptable. Document that fact, and you should be fine.